Hi everybody. In this video, we're going to start looking at our final kinds of details to make sure that what we're working with is exactly what we're going to want to take into ZBrush and make sure that everything's kind of all refined and cleaned up as much as possible. Now, one thing I do want to do is just adjust my material here. It's just a little bit bright. It's not really matching the concept anymore, especially now that I have the appropriate kind of color scheme to go with it. Just want to make sure that everything kind of matches up. And in fact, I am going to add in one more material here for the stone. Again, it's really good when you're kind of working with this kind of stuff to just make sure that all your materials are correct and looking the way that they should so that you've got something to work with that is the most reminiscent of your concept as possible, just to make sure you're not kind of missing any invaluable details that might exist therein. So just pull that out a little bit more too. I think there might be a little bit more space and size that I could give to this piece as well. There you go. So now let's just kind of pull this out a little bit here. Just pull this down. Having that all kind of drawn out in this way helps us really get a sense of if we're working with this thing the way that we need to. Now, one thing we can do is go to high quality mode. And what's useful in this is that we can just kind of let the screen pause for a moment. And usually what'll happen is our ambient occlusion will set in and we'll start to be able to see our shape just a little bit better than we did before. And that's working out pretty decent. Now, the thing we can start to figure out is, do we start to add in these small lines and crevices and cracks and things like that? And I would say for me personally, no. I am taking this model into ZBrush, so a lot of those details I find to be much easier to make inside of ZBrush than anywhere else. So I prefer to keep stuff like that inside of ZBrush rather than over here inside Max, where they're a little bit more of a hassle to work on. Now, one of the things that I do want to do is potentially start to add just a little bit more sort of substantiability to these pieces here. So for example, this piece, it looks nice, but it doesn't really connect in here in any kind of logical way. It doesn't really fit properly on this surface. So we do want to make sure that that's kind of figured out in a bit more of an interesting way. So there's a couple things that we're going to have to edit here to make sure that this works well inside of ZBrush or anything like that. So let's just edit this a little bit. So in fact, in this case, I do want to kind of maybe remove this symmetry or potentially add a little bit of geometry here that isn't there normally. So this shell I don't think is helping me anymore. Let's just try to pull this down here and see if we can remove it entirely. So let's just collapse this in. And now we've seen that this is, with a collapse, turned into an editable mesh, and that's not what I want to use. So again, just drop down an editable poly, right click and do a collapse 2 again, and this will convert into an editable mesh without us having to collapse or remove or change our geometry in any way. So that works out pretty decent. So let's just see here. Now what I want to do is add just a little bit more shape to this, add in just a couple extra edges here. So for example, let's just add in a little bit of geometry here to kind of push this whole thing together. I'm going to extrude this in and let's just kind of pull this together a bit. I think something like that will actually work pretty decent for us without having to do too much finagling with that shape. Of course, this thing itself becomes a little bit unwieldy, but that's fine. We can kind of come back to it later. But now the shape that we create here will connect a little bit better inside of this area here, and will actually look like it's connecting with these pieces inside as well, which I think is a positive. Now, it doesn't match the concept. The concept doesn't have anything like this on it. You can't really see it. But it makes this make more sense functionally speaking, so it's absolutely worth keeping and doing. We can still, of course, adjust any of these kinds of proportions here where they're not appropriate anymore. So places like this, we could start to try to drag up or align up a little bit better with the existing piece here. So in cases like this, it starts to get a little bit confusing to deal with, so it can be worth it to just take this piece here. We can copy that symmetry and just do a collapse 2, and then we can start editing this piece, but we could still drop down a paste of that. Let's just drag this down here. Let's remove these and just see what our mirror looks like. Now, in this case, it's not necessarily doing what we want. It's not quite in the right position. If we need to make sure that that works a little bit better, you can select the model by itself or just the edges that you want. And you could drop down another symmetry. And in many cases, it'll appear in the general area where it's supposed to. like this. There we go. Just got to rotate it into the right spot. But a lot of times being able to select those edges, there we go, we can see that that's working perfectly, will allow you to drop a modifier on top of the exact location that you need it to be. So that works pretty decent. This one might not have been the correct one. Oh, my copy and paste did work. Well, doesn't really matter. Not a big deal in this case. I'll drop down another symmetry over top of this whole piece here. Let's just affect our pivot, align it to this object. Perfectly fine. Whenever you lose things like that, it's really not worth trying to bring back. It's much easier just to kind of duplicate and put back into its proper location anyways, in case it was not there in the first place. There we go. Perfect. So in this case, we can see two ways to do that symmetry if you need to. But now we can grab this piece here and start to adjust it in a way that's going to maybe make a little bit more sense for ourselves. Let's just kind of pull this up a little bit. Maybe up into this section here, because I think that'll start to look a little bit more reasonable. Let's pull it together a little bit. We do want this stuff to be relatively clean, so we don't want to start causing weird issues. And just for the sake of clarity, let's also chamfer this section here. And let's use some target welds to kind of just clean up some of what's going on there as well. Clean up that. And that's pretty decent. Not a big deal if any of this geometry is just not super clean or anything like that. We can tidy it up afterwards. We just kind of want to make sure that that design works well on this structure. And that works well. We don't lose proportion on the legs. We've still got this interesting piece at the back. But one thing I do want to add into this is just a little bit more structure into the rest. So for example, I want to remove this piece here. Let's just delete that as well. And I want to kind of curve this out. So let's just try this. So let's do a chamfer here. Let's increase that there. Let's add a couple of segments to this and go with something a little bit taller. It's going to cut into this section here, but that's not a big deal right now. Oh, let's do that again. Let's just do a chamfer, say OK, and have a look at that there. So in this case, it's not quite doing what I want. It's a little bit better than this. This angle just looks a little bit too sharp in this case. And there's no harm in sometimes just modifying a concept, because sometimes just the concept itself may not be working. I always recommend you check with your art director or the person that's kind of approving these things. Sometimes a concept artist is working with something that they thought was a good idea, but in practice you start to realize that it just doesn't quite work in the gameplay space, and so you modify it, you adjust. You just make sure that it works for the context that you're trying to actually build it for. And in this case, for example, I'm going to collapse down this symmetry one more time, collapse 2, and adjust this position, because I think that this is also just going out a little bit too far for the shape that we're working with here. I want to make sure that this overlaps nicely with the rest of what's going on here. And let's just grab this section as well and pull this in a bit more, I think. These pieces may just need just a little bit more breathing room with each other. And I think that'll actually pan out better for the design in general. Let's just give that right there. So we line some of these parts up just a little bit more. There we go. I think that's going to work a little bit better, read a little bit better. Let's just pull these in too. So again, as I pull this in, all of it's going to go in everywhere else as well. Let's pull out a little bit here. I think that'll work pretty decently. I will come back to this edge, and I don't want it to be quite so much as what I was doing before. Let's just chamfer it, give it a little bit of distance there, and a little bit of a curvature. I think that's going to read better and look better in general than what we had in the first place. Now, of course, if you want to push a certain shape out in any kind of way, such as this section here, let's say we want to take this whole thing and just kind of push it out. Now, there's a few things we can do. In Max 2017, we've got local aligned, which kind of just pushes things out in the general direction of the shape that you have. It's really, really useful to work with, and I actually quite like it. It's one of the few updated features for 2017 that I'm really happy with for these kind of things. Let's just bring that back off and flatten this shape as well. And let's just kind of flatten this section here so that that looks like a proper end of this piece. There we go. So that's pretty decent. That's going to look good there. We give a little bit more shape to this surface and kind of clean it up a little bit. So that's going to work out pretty decent for us. There's a couple more things that we might just be missing here. This piece we could duplicate down and test out just to make sure that we want to keep this piece. So just got to get the right gizmo selection here. Kind of pull this into this position because we're actually missing that section right here. And again, we use our snaps to kind of just put these things where they should go. You know what, let's just snap it all together in there. Pull it in like this. Pull that over. And all of this is just minor modifications just to kind of make sure that this stuff goes where it looks like it should. Again, I'll just kind of use my snaps. I find them to be the fastest way to kind of block in any of these general ideas. There we go. As long as you get that angle right, of course. Let's just pull that down a little bit. And again, that symmetry will help us out. And we can start to see, as I block this in, I'm starting to really feel like this doesn't work. Like this shape actually does not fit this surface very well. And so in some cases, you can just kind of say, well, you know, at the end of the day, it's my job to make sure that this looks good or works. And you can start to remove certain details if they're not working in the functional setup of the model. Leave it out and try it somewhere else, or just don't use it. Check with a concept artist, check with your art director, make sure that that stuff is okay to remove, and go from there. So this looks pretty good. I think at this point, all we want to do is add in some really fine little adjustments, such as chamfers and things like that, and get this ready to go into ZBrush.